The iron gates of the D'Aubigny estate didn't so much open as groan, a sound of rusted metal mourning its own decay. Lord Cassian Nightford sat atop his charger, the animal's breath huffing in the damp morning air, as he looked upon the bounty the crown had seen fit to bestow upon him. To the world, it was a reward for his unwavering hand in the border wars. To Cassian, it was a cemetery of gray stone and scorched earth. The decree in his pocket felt like a brand, a permanent reminder of the price of his metals. He had expected silence, the profound, empty silence of a place that had been cleansed by fire and steel. Instead, as he navigated the debris of the courtyard, he caught the faint, unmistakable smell of wood smoke and wild herbs. His hand dropped instinctively to the hilt of his sword, the soldier's mask of iron indifference settling over his features. The official reports had been clear. The lands were vacated. The rebels were gone. "Step out," Cassian commanded, his voice a low rasp that cut through the mist. He pointed with a gloved hand toward the jagged shadows of the manor's west wing, his decorated military coat heavy with the weight of authority and suspicion. "By the Marquess's authority, reveal yourselves." The ruins seemed to exhale. From the collapsed archway, a woman emerged. She was weary, her gown a tattered shroud of its former finery, but she moved with a defiance that no war could strip away. Behind her, small, frightened faces peered out from the gloom, dirt-streaked children clinging to her skirts like survivors of a shipwreck. The shock of it hit Cassian with more force than a cavalry charge. These were the rebel remnants the decree had ordered him to clear. The woman met his gaze with eyes of burning amber, a fierce protectiveness that mirrored the very fire he had spent years trying to extinguish. He had come to claim a prize of land and title, but as the children's wide, hollow eyes fixed upon his decorated uniform, Cassian realized the war had followed him home. The enemy he had been sent to eliminate was not an army, but the very innocence he had forgotten how to protect. Cassian's boots crunched through the layer of fine, gray ash that coated the entrance to the manor's west wing, each step sounding like a bone snapping in the heavy silence. The air here was different from the biting wind of the moors. It was stagnant, thick with the scent of damp masonry and the lingering, acrid ghost of a fire that had burned years ago. He kept one hand resting near the hilt of his heavy cavalry saber, not out of fear, but out of the muscle memory of a man who had lived in enemy territory for far too long. His eyes, narrowed and sharp, scanned the jagged silhouettes of the rafters that clawed at the gray sky above. "Show yourself," he commanded. The words were not a request. They were a strike of flint against stone, cold and sparks bright. "I know there is breath in these ruins. By order of the crown, this land is claimed. Step into the light or be cleared with the debris." For a long moment, only the wind answered, whistling through a shattered window frame like a low, mournful flute. Then, a shadow detached itself from the gloom of a collapsed pantry. She did not stumble out, nor did she cower. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that the tattered remains of her charcoal gray gown could not disguise. Her hair, once perhaps a crown of gold, was now a tangled web of chestnut and dust, yet she held her head with a terrifying aristocratic poise. As she stepped into the pale shaft of afternoon light, Cassian felt the iron indifference he had worn like armor begin to chafe. Her face was gaunt, her skin streaked with the soot of a scavenger, but her eyes, a startling, defiant amber, locked onto his with the force of a physical blow. "The Marquess of Nightford, I presume," she said. Her voice was a low rasp, yet it carried the unmistakable cadence of the high courts. "Come to survey the graveyard he so diligently prepared?" Cassian's hand tightened on his scabbard. "I am here to claim what is mine by right of service. These lands were vacated by the rebels 3 winters ago." Vacated. Mirabel's lips curled into a mirthless smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Is that the word the crown uses for a massacre?" "We did not vacate, my lord. We simply waited for the fire to go out." She moved then, stepping slightly to the side to reveal what she had been shielding in the darkness of the alcove. A collective gasp, small and rhythmic, rose from the shadows. 3 children, then 5, and finally nearly a dozen emerged from the gloom. They were small, dirt-streaked specters with hollow cheeks and eyes too large for their faces. They clung to the frayed hem of her skirts and the tattered sleeves of her bodice, their tiny hands clutching the fabric as if it were the only anchor left in a drowning world. Cassian stood frozen, the metals on his heavy military coat suddenly feeling like leaden weights against his chest. He had spent his life fighting men with steel in their hands and hatred in their hearts. He had been trained to hunt rebels and insurgents, terms that were easy to categorize in a command tent. But looking at the trembling boy who hid behind the Duchess's leg, a child no older than 6 with a jagged scar across his brow, the soldier's mask he wore began to crack. "They are orphans of your war," Mirabel said, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed louder than his shout. She placed a protective hand on the head of the nearest girl, her fingers trembling but her stance unyielding. "They are the remnants your decree ordered you to clear. So, tell me, Marquess, does your bounty include the cost of their burials? Or will you permit them to starve in the shadows of your new home?" Cassian looked from the fierce, broken beauty of the woman to the frightened, innocent eyes of the children. The authority he had carried into the courtyard felt hollow, a brittle thing compared to the raw, quiet power of the lady in the ashes. He was a man of orders, a man who believed in the clarity of the law, but as the wind howled through the ruined D'Aubigny halls, he realized that the enemy he had been sent to eliminate was the only thing left worth saving. The twilight that descended upon the D'Aubigny estate was not a gentle fading of light, but a cold, suffocating blanket that smelled of damp earth and old failures. Inside the skeletal remains of the great hall, Cassian Nightford sat at a makeshift table, a fallen door propped up by stacks of charred masonry. Beside him, a single oil lantern cast long, flickering shadows that danced like ghosts against the peeling wallpaper. He stared at the parchment spread before him, the heavy wax seal of the crown glinting like a drop of dried blood. Cleansing of the lands. That was the language of the decree. It was a sterile military term that omitted the reality of small hands and hollow gazes. He stood, the metals on his military coat clinking with a sharp, metallic sound that felt like a bell tolling in a graveyard. He adjusted his collar, pulling the stiff fabric tight against his throat, as if the uniform itself could reinforce the iron indifference he felt slipping. He had a duty to his rank, to the peace he had bled to secure, and to the family name that had been built on the very ground he now stood upon. With a heavy sigh that rattled in his chest, he picked up the lantern and made his way toward the west wing. He found them huddled in the corner of what had once been a grand morning room. Mirabel sat on a pile of moth-eaten tapestries, her back against a damp stone wall, while the children were layered around her like pups in a den. The amber light of his lantern hit them, and a dozen pairs of eyes widened in terror. The smallest child, a girl with hair like tangled silk, buried her face in Mirabel's tattered bodice. "The wagons will be here at first light," Cassian said, his voice flat and devoid of the tremor he felt in his heart. "I have arranged for transport to the coastal provinces. There are shelters there, administered by the ministry." Mirabel did not look up immediately. She continued to stroke the hair of the sobbing girl, her fingers moving with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. When she finally raised her head, her gaze was so sharp it felt like a blade pressing against his throat. "Shelters," she repeated, the word dripping with a duchess's quiet scorn. "You mean the workhouses, Marquess. You mean the places where children are sold for the price of a coal shovel and the sick are left to rot in the damp. Do not dress your cruelty in the language of administration." "It is the law, Mirabel," Cassian snapped, the iron in his voice cracking. "These lands are a war bounty. They must be settled, restored. You cannot have the evidence of your sins staring at you from across the dinner table," she interrupted, rising slowly to her feet. Despite her frayed gown and the soot on her brow, she stood with a dignity that made his medals feel like cheap tin. Look at them, Cassian. Truly look at them. Tell the boy with the scarred brow that he must leave the only home he remembers because a Marquess needs his quiet. Cassian looked. The boy with the scar was watching him, not with the hatred he expected, but with a profound, weary curiosity. The child wasn't looking at a conqueror. He was looking at a man who held the power of life and death in a single gloved hand. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the weight of the war. Cassian reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold steel of his signet ring. He should have turned away. He should have reaffirmed the dawn departure. But as the wind howled through the broken rafters, he saw the youngest girl shiver, her small frame racked by the biting chill of the ruins. Without a word, Cassian stepped forward. The children scrambled back, but he didn't reach for them. Instead, he unbuttoned his heavy, wool-lined military coat, the very symbol of his authority and his service. He draped it over the shivering girl and the boy beside her. The garment was vast on them, a sea of navy blue and gold braid that smelled of wood smoke and old leather. "The wagons will not be coming," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. He turned on his heel before Mirabel could speak, before he could see the shock in her amber eyes. He returned to the great hall and spent the rest of the night not in sleep, but in labor. He hauled heavy beams to block the drafty windows. He shared his own military rations, leaving the tins at the threshold of their room like an offering to a forgotten god. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the ash-gray moors in hues of bruised purple, Cassian stood at the perimeter of the estate. He was cold, his shirt sleeves offering no protection against the dawn frost, but his stance was unyielding. He watched the road, half expecting the crown surveyors to arrive. He was no longer just a Marquess claiming a bounty. He was a silent guardian standing watch over a ruin. And for the first time in 3 years, the weight of his medals didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. The library was a cavern of lost thoughts, a space where the scent of damp parchment and rotting leather hung heavy in the frigid air. Cassian stepped over a pile of fallen floorboards, his lantern casting a long, skeletal shadow across the empty shelves that reached toward the darkened ceiling. Most of the books had been scavenged for fuel or left to the mercy of the rain that leaked through the shattered dome. But the room still held a ghost of the intellectual sanctuary it had once been. He wasn't here for poetry or philosophy. He was looking for the land deeds, the legal anchors that would allow him to hold this ruin against the crown surveyors. If he were to protect the remnants he had found in the West Wing, he needed more than a sword and a heavy coat. He needed the weight of the law. As he moved toward a massive mahogany desk that sat like a stubborn sentinel in the center of the room, he noticed how the fire had licked at its legs but failed to consume it. He pulled at the drawers, their wood swollen and groaning against the humidity. In the bottommost compartment, his fingers brushed against a seam that felt out of place. It was a false bottom, a thin sliver of wood that didn't sit flush with the rest of the frame. With a sharp tug, the wood splintered, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a silk ribbon. The wax seal on the top envelope made Cassian's heart stop. It was a hawk with its talons spread, his father's signet. He sank into a soot-stained chair, the iron indifference he had practiced for a decade turning to ice in his veins. The letters were dated 4 years ago, written in his father's elegant, precise hand. As he read, the room seemed to grow smaller, the silence louder. These were not the letters of a Marquess discussing the defense of the realm. They were the cold, calculated blueprints for a heist. His father, the man Cassian had idolized as a paragon of duty and military honor, had been coordinating with the regional commander months before the first shot was ever fired. The D'Aubigny rebellion had never been an act of treason. It had been a desperate, starved response to a systematic freezing of the Duchess's accounts and the deliberate seizure of grain stores by the Nightford interest. "The provocation is nearly complete," one letter stated. "Once the Duke's husband is forced to strike back to feed his people, the crown will have no choice but to authorize a total clearing of the valley. The D'Aubigny wealth is vast, and their lands are essential for the expansion of our own holdings. Ensure the boy Cassian is given the lead in the suppression. It will blood him well and secure the lineage's claim to the bounty." Cassian dropped the parchment, the dry rattle of the paper sounding like a gunshot in the hollow room. He had spent 3 years bleeding and watching his men die for a cause that was nothing more than a land grab. The medals pinned to his coat, the very symbols of his pride, felt like shards of glass pressing into his skin. He hadn't been a hero of the crown. He had been his father's unwitting executioner. A soft footfall sounded at the library door. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Mirabel stood in the shadows, the pale light of his lantern catching the amber of her eyes. She didn't look like a beggar now. She looked like a judge. She saw the letters scattered on the desk, and the look of raw, hollow grief that crossed her face told him she had long suspected the truth. "You found them," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight that nearly brought him to his knees. Cassian looked at the proof of his family's crimes, then at the woman who had survived the fire they had lit. "He destroyed your world for a boundary line," he said, his voice thick with a shame that no military rank could erase. "He destroyed it because he knew you would follow orders," Mirabel replied, stepping into the room. She didn't come to comfort him. She came to witness his realization. "And now, Marquess, the war is over, and the bounty is yours. What will you do with a home built on the blood of the innocent?" Cassian looked at the hawk seal, the symbol of the man who had shaped him. With a slow, deliberate motion, he crushed the letter in his fist. The blind obedience that had defined his life was gone, burned away by the truth of the library's secret. He looked at Mirabel, and for the first time he didn't see an enemy or a squatter. He saw his only chance at a life that wasn't a lie. "I will hold this land," Cassian said, his voice regaining the iron of his former life. But this time, it was forged in a different fire. "But not for the crown, and certainly not for my father's name. I will hold it for those who are left." The rain returned with the sunset, a rhythmic drumming on the leaden roof of the west wing that masked the sound of the wind. Inside the small, cleared parlor, the only room besides the morning room that still held its ceiling, Cassian had started a fire in the hearth. It was a meager thing, fed by the broken remains of a gilded chair and damp kindling, but it cast a warmth that softened the jagged edges of the ruins. On the low table between them sat a loaf of coarse, dark bread and a small pot of salted beef, the steam rising in thin, ghostly ribbons. Mirabel sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of hot water. The flickering light caught the sharp lines of her cheekbones and the depth of her amber eyes, which remained fixed on the dancing flames. The discovery in the library hung between them like a physical weight, a thick curtain of betrayal that had stripped Cassian of his pride and Mirabel of her mystery. "Eat," Cassian said quietly, pushing the bread toward her. He had carved the loaf with his belt knife, the same blade that had seen 3 years of trench warfare. "The children have already been fed. I made sure they had the lion's share." Mirabel reached out, her fingers pale and trembling as she took a piece. She tore a small morsel, her movements still possessing that haunting, duchess-like grace even in the face of starvation. "A truce of bread, Marquess?" she asked, her voice carrying a trace of the old irony, though it was softened by exhaustion. "Or is this a final meal before the next set of orders arrives?" "There are no more orders," Cassian replied, his voice rough. He looked at the bread, but he couldn't bring himself to eat. Every bit of comfort he found in this house now felt stolen. "I have spent my life believing that the world was built on a foundation of duty. To find it was built on a ledger of greed. I find I have little appetite for anything the crown has given me." Mirabel looked at him then, her gaze searching his face for the iron she had come to expect. She found only the hollowed-out grief of a man who had lost his faith. "You are not the first soldier to find that his medals are made of lead," she said softly. "But you are perhaps the first to look at the survivors and see faces instead of obstacles." She gestured toward the heavy oak door that led to the children's sleeping quarters. "Do you know who they are, Cassian?" "Truly?" He looked at the door, the image of the boy with the scarred brow vivid in his mind. "They are the lost," he muttered. "The remnants. They are the legacy of the Nightford regiment," Mirabel corrected, her voice turning cold and precise. She pointed toward the shadows. "The girl with the tangled hair? Her father was the miller at the Blackwood crossing. Your men burned the mill to deny the rebels cover. He was inside. The boy with the scar? His family held the tenant farm on the eastern ridge. They were evicted in the middle of a blizzard because your father's agents claimed the land was needed for military fortifications that were never built." Cassian felt the room tilt. He remembered the Blackwood crossing. He remembered the order to clear the ridge. He had signed the dispatches himself, convinced he was protecting the supply lines from a phantom insurgency. "Every child in that room is an orphan of your specific efficiency," Mirabel continued, her amber eyes locking onto his with a devastating clarity. "They were not displaced by the war. They were displaced by you. My husband did not take up arms to overthrow a king. He took them up because he couldn't stand to watch his people hunted like vermin for the crime of owning fertile soil." Cassian sank back into the chair, the silence of the library's secret now amplified by the names of the dead. The bread on the table sat untouched, a symbol of a peace he didn't deserve. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held the pen and the sword, and for the first time, he saw them as the children must see them. "I thought I was saving the province," he whispered, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "You were saving a boundary line for a man who didn't care who lived on either side of it," Mirabel replied. She stood up, her tattered gown rustling like dead leaves on the stone floor. She didn't look at him with hatred, which would have been easier to bear. She looked at him with a weary, profound pity. "You have your bounty, Lord Nightford, but the bread you eat tonight was grown in the blood of the people who should have been your neighbors." She turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. "If you truly wish for a truce, do not look for it in the law. Look for it in the eyes of the boy who still wakes up screaming when he hears the sound of a horse's hooves." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Cassian alone with the dying fire and the cold, salted beef. He stared at the dark loaf of bread, realizing that the war bounty he had claimed was not a reward, but a penance. And as the rain continued to wash the ash from the ruins outside, he knew that the only way to earn the bread he shared was to become the shield for the very lives he had nearly extinguished. The morning arrived not with the sun, but with a low, suffocating fog that clung to the blackened ribs of the D'Aubigny ruins like a shroud. Cassian was at the perimeter, his hands buried in the pockets of his tunic, his eyes tracking the silver-gray horizon. He didn't need to see them to know they were coming. The rhythmic drumming of high-strung cavalry mounts and the sharp, distant jingle of harness brass carried through the damp air with the precision of an executioner's bell. He turned and moved toward the west wing, his pace hurried but silent. The iron indifference he had worn for a decade felt brittle now, a rusted plate of armor that threatened to shatter at the first strike. He burst into the morning room, where Mirabel was already awake, sitting among the children as they shared the last of the salted beef he had provided the night before. "They are here," Cassian said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. Mirabel stood instantly, her amber eyes wide with a terror she couldn't quite mask behind her duchess's pride. The children froze, spoons hovering halfway to their mouths, their small faces turning ashen in the dim light. The boy with the scarred brow reached for Mirabel's hand, his fingers trembling. "Who?" Mirabel whispered. "Colonel Sterling," Cassian replied, his jaw tightening. "He is the crown's hand when it comes to sanitizing a district." He doesn't just clear lands, he erases people. If he finds you here, if he finds them, there will be no wagons to the coast. Only the ditch. He didn't wait for her to argue. He moved to the center of the room, kicking aside a rotted rug to reveal a heavy iron ring set into the floorboards. With a grunt of effort that strained the seams of his shirt, he hauled upward. The trapdoor groaned, revealing a narrow, stone-lined staircase that descended into the damp blackness of the old wine cellars. "Go. Now," he commanded. Mirabel didn't hesitate. She gathered the children with a silent, frantic efficiency, ushering them toward the hole. The smallest girl began to whimper, and Cassian knelt, pressing a finger to his lips. "Not a sound," he whispered, his eyes locking onto the child's. "You must be as still as the stones themselves." One by one they vanished into the earth. Mirabel was the last. She paused on the first step, her face level with the floor. "And you, Marquess?" she asked. "What will you tell the man who taught you how to kill?" "I will tell him what he expects to hear," Cassian said, his voice turning as cold as the mist outside. "That the land is as empty as my father's heart." He slammed the trapdoor shut and dragged the rug back over it, just as the first bugle call tore through the silence of the courtyard. He met them in the center of the ruins. A troop of 20 riders sat like statues in the fog, their brass buttons glinting with a dull, menacing light. At their head was Colonel Sterling, a man whose face was a map of old scars and whose eyes held the predatory stillness of a hawk. He sat atop a massive black horse, his posture perfectly erect, his silver-tipped crop tapping rhythmically against his boot. "Lord Nightford," Sterling said, his voice a dry, cultured drawl. "I expected to find you in a tent in the valley, not nesting in the bones of the enemy." Cassian stood his ground, his feet planted in the ash. "The estate is mine by bounty, Colonel. I chose to survey the property from within." Sterling dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, his boots striking the earth with a finality that made Cassian's pulse drum in his ears. The colonel walked toward the west wing, his gaze roaming over the jagged rafters and the piles of debris. His shadow fell across the scorched stone like a stain. "The surveyors reported smoke 3 days ago," Sterling said, stopping just short of the doorway where the children were hidden beneath the floor. "And my outposts mention a woman seen scavenging near the ridge. I was under the impression your regiment was thorough, Cassian. I didn't come all this way to find that you'd left weeds in a garden I paid for in blood." "The smoke was my own," Cassian replied, stepping into the colonel's path, his shadow meeting Sterling's. "And the woman was a ghost of the moors, likely a wanderer who fled at the first sight of my uniform. The land is cleared, Sterling. There is nothing left here but dust." Sterling smiled, a thin, jagged line that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned in, the scent of expensive tobacco and horse sweat thick around him. "Your father was a man of absolute clarity, Marquess. He understood that a rebellion is only dead when there is no one left to remember its name. I would hate to think the sun has grown soft in the damp of the north." The colonel turned toward the morning room, his hand reaching for the latch. Inside the cellar, a child's muffled cough echoed, a sound so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. Sterling froze, his head cocking to the side. "Did you hear that, Cassian?" Sterling whispered. Cassian felt the iron in his blood turn to ice. He looked at the colonel's hand on the door, then at the troop of soldiers waiting in the courtyard. In that moment, the weight of the library's secret and the truce of bread coalesced into a single, terrifying truth. He was no longer a soldier of the crown. He was the only thing standing between the children and a shallow grave. "A rat in the walls, Colonel," Cassian said, his voice steady as a rifle shot. "The house is full of them. Shall I have my men burn the rest of it to satisfy your ears? Or can we proceed to the logistical handover?" Sterling lingered for a heartbeat longer, his gaze boring into the wood of the door as if he could see through to the cellar below. Then, he stepped back, his shadow retreating from the threshold. "Logistics, then," he said. "But I shall be staying the night, Nightford. I wish to see the sunrise over a truly empty valley." As the colonel turned back toward his horse, Cassian stood in the doorway, the colonel's shadow still lingering in the room behind him. He looked at the rug covering the trapdoor, knowing that the longest night of his life had only just begun. The floorboards above groaned under the weight of Sterling's sentries, their heavy, rhythmic pacing sounding like a heartbeat for the dying house. Cassian sat by the dying fire in the morning room, his gaze fixed on the rug that concealed the trapdoor. Above him, in the rafters, the wind whistled a hollow tune, but it was the silence from below that roared in his ears. Every few minutes, the sharp laughter of a soldier or the clink of a bottle drifted from the great hall, reminders that he was a man under siege within his own bounty. When the house finally settled into the restless quiet of midnight, Cassian moved. He did not take a lantern. He knew the path by the cold memory of the stones. He slipped beneath the rug and descended into the cellar, the air turning thick with the smell of earth and aged wine. At the bottom of the stairs he found Mirabel. She was sitting against a crate of moldering vintage, the children huddled in blankets around her feet, their breathing deep and rhythmic in the dark. "He is not gone," she whispered before he could speak. Her voice was a silver thread in the blackness. "He is staying until the dawn," Cassian replied, kneeling beside her. The darkness was so absolute he could only see the pale glint of her eyes. "Mirabel, why is he truly here? Sterling does not ride to the border for logistics or weeds. He is a hunter of high prizes. He spoke of your husband as if he were a thief, not a rebel." Mirabel was silent for a long moment. He heard her reach into the folds of her tattered gown, the fabric rasping. When she spoke again, her voice was stripped of its duchess's poise, replaced by the raw weight of a woman who had carried a secret until it had bowed her spine. "He does not want the land, Cassian. He never did. The Nightford interest wanted the grain and the boundaries, yes, but the crown. The crown is hollow. The wars you fought, the victories you won, they drained the treasury until the king was trading his own crown for iron and lead." She reached out, her fingers brushing his palm. She placed something small and heavy in his hand. It was cold, a piece of metal shaped like a sunburst with a single, jagged crack through its center. "The Solarium Horde," Cassian breathed, the name a legend among the northern regiments. It was said the D'Aubigny line had served as the secret bankers to the old kings, holding a reserve of bullion that could buy a kingdom thrice over. "It was never a legend," Mirabel said. "It was our duty. When the rebellion, the provocation, began, my husband didn't just fight to feed our people. He fought to hide the gold from a king who would use it to fuel more fires. The crown believes I am the only living soul who knows the location of the vaults. To them, I am not a rebel or a squatter. I am a key." Cassian looked at the sunburst in his hand, the iron in his heart turning to lead. The realization shattered the last remnants of his military world. The cleansing hadn't been about peace or borders. It was a torture session waiting to happen. Sterling wasn't there to survey the ruins. He was there to find the ghost of D'Aubigny and squeeze the location of the horde from her throat. "They think if they kill the woman, they can find the gold," Cassian said, his voice a low growl. "No," Mirabel corrected, her amber eyes catching a stray sliver of light from the stairwell. "They think if they kill the children, the woman will speak. Sterling knows I would die before I gave the king a single coin, but he also knows I cannot watch an innocent bleed." Cassian closed his fist around the sunburst. The war bounty was a trap. He had been sent here not as a reward, but as a sentinel or perhaps as a lure. If he had cleared the land as ordered, he would have delivered the key directly into Sterling's hands without ever knowing the value of what he had discarded. The sound of a heavy boot striking the floorboards directly above them made them both freeze. A muffled voice called out, Sterling's voice, asking a sentry about the security of the West Wing. "You have to leave," Mirabel whispered, her grip on his hand tightening. "If he finds you here, he will know you've turned. He will execute you for treason before the sun rises." Cassian looked at the children, then at the woman who had lived in the ashes to protect a legacy that was now a death sentence. He wasn't just a Marquess anymore. He was a man holding a broken sunburst in a darkened cellar, realizing that the greatest treasure of the D'Aubigny line wasn't the gold. It was the woman who had been overlooked by a world of men. "I am not leaving," Cassian said, his voice gaining a resonance that felt older than his rank. "If they want the key, they will have to break the shield first." He climbed the stairs, leaving her in the dark. As he emerged back into the morning room and pulled the rug into place, he looked at his medals resting on the table. They were cold, shallow things. He realized then that the crown had sent a soldier to claim a bounty, but the man had found a war he finally believed in. The dawn did not break the fog. It only turned the world into a vast, luminous bruise of violet and gray. Cassian stood on the steps of the morning room, his breath hitching in the cold, watching Sergeant Miller inspect the tethered horses of Sterling's troop. Miller had been with him since the first breach at the Blackwood Crossing. A man of few words and a steady hand who had shared the grim silence of the trenches. But this morning, the sergeant did not meet his commander's eyes. He moved with a stiff, calculated distance that felt more like an indictment than a greeting. Inside the ruins, the iron indifference that had served as Cassian's armor was being picked apart by the reality of the cellar below. He could feel the weight of the children and the Duchess through the very stones beneath his boots. He had spent the night alternating between the cold watch of the perimeter and the suffocating secret of the trapdoor, but he hadn't accounted for the eyes that had watched him for years. A soldier's greatest strength is his ability to notice the slightest shift in his commander's rhythm, and Miller was a master of the craft. The betrayal happened not with a shout, but with the soft rustle of a cinched saddle. Cassian watched from the shadows as Miller leaned close to a young corporal, a lad from the capital who had arrived with Sterling's detachment. A small, wax-sealed scrap of parchment was exchanged, a flicker of white passing between gloved hands. Before Cassian could step forward, the boy swung into his saddle and spurred his mount toward the valley road, the horse's hooves throwing up clods of damp ash as he vanished into the mist. "Sergeant," Cassian called out, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that cut through the morning damp. Miller turned, his face as unreadable as the scorched hills. He stood at attention, his salute precise, yet his gaze remained fixed on the medals pinned to Cassian's chest. "My Lord Marquess," he said, the title sounding like a mockery in the hollow courtyard. "The corporal leaves in a hurry," Cassian noted, stepping into the light. "I don't recall authorizing a courier to the capital." "He carries a report for the Ministry of War, sir," Miller replied, his voice devoid of the warmth they had shared over campfires. "The colonel requested a status update on the cleansing of the estate, but I thought it prudent to add a private addendum regarding the unexpected discoveries found in the West Wing." Cassian felt the blood in his veins turn to slush. "You've seen her." "I saw the Duchess, sir. And I saw the children," Miller said, finally meeting Cassian's eyes. There was no hatred there, only the cold, transactional greed of a man who had seen too much poverty and wanted his own share of the peace. "The crown offers a bounty for the lands, but they offer a king's ransom for the ghost of D'Aubigny. And for the officer who hides her, they offer a traitor's noose. I've followed you into fire for 3 years, Marquess, but I won't follow you into a grave for the sake of an enemy's brood." The weight of the betrayal was physical, a blow that left Cassian's world spinning. By sending that word, Miller hadn't just secured a reward. He had signaled the end of the truce. The capital was days away, but once that message was read, the war bounty would become a hunt. Every man in the ruins, every orphan in the cellar, and Cassian himself now carried a price on their head that would draw every mercenary and royal enforcer in the province. Cassian looked toward the valley road, knowing it was too late to catch the rider. He turned back to the sergeant, his hand tightening on the hilt of his saber. The found family he had discovered in the ashes was no longer a secret to be guarded. They were a target to be defended. "You think you've bought your future, Miller?" Cassian whispered, his voice gaining the terrifying resonance of a man who had nothing left to lose. "But all you've done is turn this ruin into a fortress. And God help anyone who tries to cross the threshold." He turned on his heel, leaving the sergeant in the courtyard, and moved toward the west wing. He had to tell Mirabel. He had to tell her that the world was coming for them, and that the Marquess was now just another man in the shadows, fighting for a home that was about to be surrounded. The mist did not lift. It simply thickened into a wall of white as the rhythmic thunder of 100 hooves began to vibrate through the floorboards of the manor. Cassian stood at the threshold of the west wing, his feet planted firmly in the gray ash that had become his penance. He had stripped the metals from his chest, leaving only the dark, unadorned wool of his military coat. The iron indifference he had once worn like a shroud was gone, replaced by a clarity that burned hotter than any fire Sterling could light. From the fog, the battalion emerged. They were no longer a small troop. Sterling had returned with the full weight of the crown's authority, row after row of bayonets glinting like cold teeth, and a sea of scarlet uniforms that stained the white mist. At their center, Colonel Sterling sat upon his black charger, his silver-tipped crop resting against his thigh. Beside him rode Sergeant Miller, his eyes averted, his hand clutching the reins of his reward. Sterling pulled his horse to a halt 10 paces from the entrance. He looked at the unadorned coat of the man standing before him and let out a short, dry laugh. "You've lost your polish, Nightford. Or have you simply forgotten which side of the war you were sent to win? I have found a side that doesn't require a ledger of lies, Colonel," Cassian replied, his voice carrying through the ruins with the resonance of a tolling bell. Behind him, in the shadows of the morning room, he could feel the presence of Mirabel and the orphans. They were no longer remnants or rebels to him. They were the heartbeat of the house he had sworn to protect. "Move aside, Marquess," Sterling commanded, his tone dropping the pretense of civility. "The message has reached the capital. The Duchess is a traitor to the crown, and the hoard she protects is royal property. Every moment you stand there, you add another knot to your own noose. We are here to cleanse this land of all remnants, starting with the ghost of D'Aubigny." Cassian did not move. He slowly drew his heavy cavalry saber, the steel singing as it left the scabbard. It was a sound that made the soldiers in the front rank shift their weight, a sound they had followed into a dozen battles. "This is no longer the clearing of a rebel land, Sterling. This is my home, and I will not have it defiled by men who trade in the lives of children." Sterling's face flushed a deep, unpleasant shade of red. He raised his hand, and a dozen rifles were brought to shoulders in a single fluid motion. The clicking of the locks was the only sound in the hollow courtyard. "You would die for a woman you were sent to displace? For a brood of rats in the cellar? I would die to be the man I thought I was before I read my father's letters," Cassian said, his voice steady as a rifle shot. He stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the ash to meet the colonel's horse. "If you want the Duchess, you will have to walk over the body of a Marquess of the realm. And I should warn you, Sterling, the men of this battalion are still watching. Let us see how many of them are willing to fire upon the commander who led them through the Blackwood crossing just to satisfy a king's greed." A profound, terrifying silence fell over the courtyard. The soldiers looked from their colonel to the man who had shared their cold rations and their darkest hours. The iron of the battalion seemed to waver, a fracture appearing in the perfect discipline of the line. Cassian stood as a human wall, his blade leveled at the heart of the machine he had once served. Sterling looked at his men, then back at Cassian, his eyes narrowing to predatory slits. He realized then that he wasn't facing a traitor. He was facing a shield, and as the wind howled through the broken rafters of D'Aubigny, the first drop of rain struck the scorched earth, marking the beginning of a storm that would either wash away the sins of the past or bury them all in the ruins. The clicking of the rifle locks had barely faded into the mist when Cassian reached into the inner pocket of his tunic. He did not pull out a pistol or a hidden blade. He withdrew the bundle of letters he had found in the library, the silk ribbon fluttering in the damp wind. The hawk seal of the Nightford lineage glinted in the pale light, a symbol of the very man who had engineered the devastation around them. "You speak of traitors, Colonel?" Cassian said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that carried to the back of the ranks. "But you are standing on a crime scene, not a battlefield. I have here the private correspondence of my father, the late Marquess, addressed to the Ministry of War and your own former commanders. It details the deliberate freezing of grain stores, the systematic provocation of the D'Aubigny tenants, and the explicit orders to manufacture a rebellion so that these lands, and the hoard they contain, could be seized." Sterling's horse shifted, sensing the sudden, sharp change in the atmosphere. The colonel's face went from a flush of rage to a mask of calculated, lethal stillness. He looked at the bundle of parchment as if it were a coiled viper. "Those are the ramblings of a dead man, Nightford," Sterling spat. "They mean nothing in the face of a royal decree." "They mean everything to the men behind you," Cassian countered. He turned his gaze away from the colonel and looked directly at the soldiers in the front rank. Men who had bled for a rebellion that was nothing more than a bank heist. "Do you hear me? You were sent here to hunt traitors, but you were actually acting as the hired muscle for a land grab. Your brothers-in-arms died at the Blackwood Crossing not to save the crown, but to fill the Nightford coffers and secure a treasure for a king who would rather see you rot in a trench than pay your pensions." A murmur rippled through the scarlet line, a sound more dangerous than the clicking of rifles. The soldiers looked at one another, the perfect discipline of the battalion fraying at the edges. They had seen Cassian's honor in the field for 3 years. They knew he was a man of his word, and the sight of his own father's seal was a blow that even Sterling's authority couldn't deflect. Cassian stepped closer to Sterling's horse, his saber still leveled. "If one shot is fired at this house, Colonel, these letters will not remain in my hand. I have already made arrangements. Copies of these dispatches are currently held by allies in the capital who are far more interested in the truth than they are in your career. If I fall, the scandal will not just bury you. It will bring down the ministry. The bloodless victory is the only one you have left. Withdraw your men, return to the valley, and report that the cleansing is complete. Tell them there is nothing left here but the dead." Sterling looked at the rifles, then at the shifting, uncertain faces of his men. He saw the iron of his battalion had turned to water. He realized then that he couldn't fire on Cassian without sparking a mutiny. The Marquess had used his father's sins as a shield, turning the family's darkest secret into the children's only hope for survival. "You are a dead man walking, Nightford," Sterling whispered, leaning down so only Cassian could hear. "The crown does not forget a theft of this magnitude. And a Nightford does not forget a debt," Cassian replied. "Now take your men and go. The estate is mine by bounty, and I am declaring it a sanctuary for the survivors." With a snarl of impotent rage, Sterling yanked his horse's head around. He raised his crop, signaling the retreat. The battalion, once a wall of scarlet and steel, began to dissolve back into the mist, the sound of their departure a rhythmic, fading thunder. Sergeant Miller was the last to turn, his eyes meeting Cassian's for a fleeting second, a look of profound, hollow regret, before he too vanished into the white. Cassian stood at the threshold until the last jingle of harness brass had faded into the silence of the moors. His arm felt like lead as he finally sheathed his blade. He turned back toward the morning room, where the rug over the trapdoor remained undisturbed. The stalemate had been won, not with blood, but with the weight of the truth. He had saved the orphans, but in doing so, he had burned every bridge to his former life. He moved toward the center of the room and sank onto a soot-stained bench, the letters resting in his lap. He was no longer a commander or a conqueror. He was just a man in a ruined house, shielding a duchess and a brood of children from a world that had forgotten them. As the first true light of dawn finally pierced the fog, painting the ash in hues of gold, Cassian realized that the war bounty he had truly won was the chance to finally live without a mask. The sun finally won its battle with the mist, piercing the jagged, broken dome of the estate's ancient chapel with shafts of solid gold. It was not the blinding, harsh light of a summer campaign, but a soft, reclaiming warmth that seemed to draw the scent of damp moss and old stone from the floorboards. Inside, the air was still, save for the rhythmic breathing of the 12 children who stood in a semicircle, their faces scrubbed clean and their eyes wide with a quiet, burgeoning hope. Cassian stood at the altar, or what remained of it, a block of scarred marble that had survived the fires of his own making. He had discarded his military tunic entirely, wearing a simple linen shirt and the dark trousers of a gentleman. He looked at his hands, no longer gloved or reaching for a hilt, and realized they were steady. Beside him stood Mirabel. She wore the tattered gray silk of her survival, yet she had woven a crown of wild moor's heather into her hair, the purple blossoms of vibrant defiance against the gray ash of her past. There was no archbishop, no assembly of the ton, and no fanfare of trumpets. Their witness was a local village priest who had returned to the valley after the battalion's retreat, a man who understood that a covenant made in ruins was often stronger than one made in a cathedral. "With this ring," Cassian said, his voice a low, resonant vow that filled the hollow space, "I take not a bounty, but a partner. I pledge my name and my life to the protection of this house and all who dwell within its shadow." He slipped a simple gold band, his mother's, rescued from the library's secret safe, onto Mirabel's finger. As he did, the weight of the war bounty officially transformed. By marrying the woman the crown called a rebel, he was not merely defying the king. He was legally binding his title to her survival. As the Duchess Consort of Nightford, Mirabel was no longer a ghost to be hunted, but a peer of the realm whom no colonel could touch without sparking a civil war. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, the children did not cheer. They simply moved forward as one, a silent tide of small bodies pressing against the new duke and duchess. The boy with the scarred brow reached out and tentatively touched the fabric of Cassian's shirt, his gaze searching for the Iron Commander and finding only a man who looked back with wet, honest eyes. "It is a sanctuary now," Mirabel whispered, her amber eyes shining as she looked at the children. "A place where the names of the dead are remembered, but the living are allowed to grow." In the weeks that followed, the D'Aubigny ruins began to breathe again. The gold from the solarium hoard, the secret Mirabel had guarded so fiercely, remained hidden for now, but Cassian used his own significant fortune to rebuild. He didn't build a fortress, he built a home. The scorched fields were plowed by the hands of the very soldiers who had stayed behind to help, men who, like Cassian, were tired of the cleansing and hungry for the harvest. The West Wing was the first to be restored, its windows glazed and its hearths roaring with fires that brought comfort rather than destruction. The orphans were no longer remnants or rebels in the eyes of the law. They were the wards of the sanctuary of Nightford, provided for with a devotion that the crown's workhouses could never replicate. As autumn turned to a mild, golden winter, Cassian stood on the ridge where he had once stood with a spyglass and a map of targets. Beside him, Mirabel watched the smoke rising from the manor's chimneys, steady, peaceful plumes that signaled a house full of life. The Marquess who had claimed a bounty of blood had vanished, replaced by a man who understood that the greatest treasure of D'Aubigny was not the gold in the earth, but the peace he had found in the margins. They had been overlooked and undervalued by a world of men and kings. But in the ruins of their old lives, they had written a new story, one of courage, compassion, and the unexpected grace of finding home in the heart of the enemy.